Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, and maybe drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. It started as a routine evening commute. I had stayed late at the office, finishing up paperwork no one cared about except my boss. By the time I got to the subway station, the platform was nearly deserted. A few tired faces stared at their phones. The train arrived with a loud screech, its headlights cutting through the dark tunnel. It looked older than usual, its paint peeling and windows grimy. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The doors shut behind me with a heavy clang. The car was almost empty, save for a man in a tattered suit sitting at the far end. He stared out the window, though the train was underground. I found a seat in the middle, clutching my briefcase tightly. The air felt colder than it should have. The train started moving, its wheels grinding against the tracks. The usual hum of commuters chatting or music playing was absent. All I could hear was the rhythmic thudding of the wheels and the occasional creak of the car. I glanced at the man in the tattered suit again. He hadn't moved. His hands rested in his lap, pale and motionless. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to look away, focusing instead on the dark window across from me. The stations passed by without stopping. The overhead speaker didn't announce their names, and the lights on the platform flickered as we sped past. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. "Excuse me," I said, turning to the man in the suit. He didn't respond. "Do you know when this train stops?" He didn't even blink. His gaze was fixed on the window, his face unnervingly still. I leaned back, unease creeping over me. The train entered a long, dark tunnel. The lights in the car flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the far end of the car. When the lights steadied, no one was there. A crackling sound came over the intercom, followed by a voice. It was deep and distorted, impossible to understand. I gripped my briefcase tighter, my palms slick with sweat. The man in the suit finally moved, turning his head toward me. His lips curled into a faint smile. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just raised a hand and pointed toward the far end of the car. I turned to look, but saw nothing. When I looked back, the man was gone. His seat was empty. I stood up, my legs shaking. The car felt longer than before, the rows of seats stretching into the distance. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The train rumbled on, its speed increasing. The intercom crackled again. This time, the voice was clearer. "All passengers prepare for arrival." My stomach dropped. "Arrival where?" I stumbled toward the nearest door, trying to find an emergency brake. But there was nothing. The windows darkened completely, as if the tunnel had swallowed all light. I could see my reflection staring back at me, only it wasn't quite my reflection. The face in the glass was mine, but its expression was twisted, its eyes hollow and lifeless. I turned away, my heart pounding. The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes echoing through the car. When it finally stopped, the doors opened with a hiss. A dense gray fog rolled in, obscuring whatever lay beyond. I didn't want to step out, but I felt an inexplicable pull, like invisible hands were urging me forward. I clutched my briefcase and stepped into the fog. The ground beneath me felt uneven, like cobblestones, and the air was damp and cold. The fog began to clear, revealing a platform unlike any I'd ever seen. It was old, crumbling, with ivy creeping up the walls. Faint whispers filled the air, though I couldn't see anyone. The train doors closed behind me, and the car disappeared into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, just sounds, like fragmented memories. A figure emerged from the fog, a tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face obscured by shadows. "Ticket, please," the conductor said, his voice low and gravelly. I fumbled with my briefcase, stammering, I don't have a ticket." He tilted his head, the shadow shifting to reveal hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. "No ticket," he said, his tone colder now. "That means you're staying." My chest tightened as the whispers around me turned into laughter, high-pitched, cruel laughter that echoed off the walls. "I don't belong here," I said, backing away. The conductor raised a hand, and the fog began to swirl violently, forming shapes, faces, hands, reaching out toward me. I turned and ran, the cobblestones slippery beneath my feet. The whispers and laughter followed, growing louder with every step. I ran blindly into the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The platform seemed endless, the crumbling walls stretching on forever. Behind me, I could hear the conductor's slow, deliberate footsteps, the whispers swirling around him like a storm. The fog thinned just enough for me to see another train car ahead. Its doors were open, the interior bathed in a dim, flickering light. I didn't stop to think. I sprinted toward it, throwing myself inside just as the doors hissed shut behind me. The train lurched forward, the sudden motion nearly knocking me off my feet. I turned, expecting to see the conductor on the platform, but he was gone. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I leaned against a seat, trying to catch my breath. This car was different from the last. The seats were old and tattered, the walls covered in graffiti that seemed to shift when I looked away. A faint smell of rot filled the air. I moved cautiously down the aisle, every nerve in my body on edge. At the far end of the car, a woman sat with her back to me. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, and her hands rested in her lap. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I stepped closer, my pulse racing. When I was just a few feet away, the woman's head snapped around to face me. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The train began to slow, its brakes screeching loudly. The woman turned away, her body rigid and unnatural. As the train came to a stop, the doors opened to reveal another foggy platform. I didn't want to step out, but the air inside the car felt oppressive, suffocating. I forced myself to move, stepping onto the platform. The fog was thicker here, the whispers returning, louder and more distinct. I could hear my name being called. The platform was empty, but the voices surrounded me, growing louder with each passing second. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. A figure emerged from the fog, a boy, no older than 10, his face pale and expressionless. "You need to find your ticket," the boy said, his voice eerily calm. "It's the only way out." I stared at him, confused. "What ticket? I don't have one." The boy didn't answer. He simply turned and pointed toward the far end of the platform. I followed his gaze, my stomach twisting with dread. In the distance, I could see a small booth, its dim light barely cutting through the fog. I hesitated, but the boy's voice urged me forward. "Hurry, before it's too late." The walk to the booth felt endless. The fog seemed to press against me, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. When I finally reached it, I found an old man sitting inside, his face hidden in shadow. "Ticket?" he rasped. "I don't have one," I said, my voice shaking. The man leaned forward, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Then you'll need to pay another way," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He simply handed me a slip of paper. The paper was blank at first, but as I stared at it, words began to appear. Asterisk, asterisk. Your debt will be collected. Asterisk, asterisk. The old man smiled, his teeth yellow and sharp. The whispers around me turned into laughter, cruel and mocking. "Enjoy your ride," he said. The train's horn blared, and I found myself back inside a car, the fog gone, the lights bright and sterile. The other passengers looked normal, engrossed in their phones. But in my pocket, the slip of paper burned cold against my skin. I knew I hadn't escaped. Not really. Next story. The idea to hike Mount Pisgah came from my friend Kevin. "It's got amazing views," he said. "We'll camp out at the summit and head back the next morning." I agreed reluctantly. I wasn't a fan of hiking, but Kevin was persuasive. That was my first mistake. We started early, the morning air crisp and fresh. The trail was quiet, with only the sound of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Kevin led the way, his enthusiasm contagious. I started to think maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. About 3 miles in, we reached a fork in the trail. The main path was clearly marked, but Kevin pointed to the other, less traveled one. "Shortcut," he said with a grin. The trail looked overgrown and uninviting, but I followed him anyway. That was my second mistake. The shortcut was steeper than I expected, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavier, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked. Kevin shrugged. "What's life without a little adventure?" We pressed on, the trail growing narrower and more difficult. Strange markings appeared on the trees, symbols carved deep into the bark. "Probably some old trail markers," Kevin said, though he didn't sound convinced. I felt a chill run down my spine. By the time we reached a clearing, the sun was starting to set. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills bathed in golden light, but my unease hadn't faded. Something about this place felt wrong, as if we were being watched. Kevin didn't seem to notice. We set up camp, pitching the tent near a cluster of trees. As we ate dinner, the forest grew eerily silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "This is kind of creepy," I said. Kevin laughed. "You're just tired." That night, I woke up to a strange noise, a low, rhythmic tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding. Kevin was still asleep. I listened, straining to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from outside the tent. My hands trembled as I unzipped the flap. The forest was dark, the moon casting long shadows on the ground. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The tapping stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just as I turned to go back inside, I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as it disappeared into the darkness. I shook Kevin awake, trying to explain what I'd seen. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "You're imagining things," he said. "Probably just an animal." But his expression changed when he saw the fear in my eyes. "All right, we'll leave first thing in the morning." Morning couldn't come fast enough. The night felt endless, every rustle of leaves sending my heart racing. When the first light of dawn appeared, we packed up quickly, eager to leave. But as we stepped onto the trail, we realized it wasn't the same path we'd come in on. The trail was overgrown, the trees gnarled and twisted. "This isn't right," I said, panic creeping into my voice. Kevin frowned, consulting the map. "We'll find our way back," he said, though he didn't sound confident. The air felt colder, the forest darker. As we walked, the strange markings reappeared. carved into nearly every tree. They seemed to form a pattern, though I couldn't make sense of it. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Kevin picked up the pace, his unease finally showing. Hours passed, but the trail only seemed to twist deeper into the forest. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the woods in an eerie gray light. "We should have been out of here by now," Kevin said, his voice tight. I didn't reply. Then we saw a figure standing in the distance, its back to us. It was tall and impossibly thin, its arms hanging at unnatural angles. "Hello?" Kevin called out, but the figure didn't move. A cold dread settled over me. "We need to go," I whispered. Kevin stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his caution. "Hey, are you okay?" he called. The figure turned slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes glinted faintly in the dim light. A low, guttural sound escaped its mouth. I grabbed Kevin's arm, pulling him back. "We need to leave," I said firmly. The figure began to move toward us, each step deliberate and unnatural. Kevin didn't argue this time. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. The trail seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. My lungs burned as I tried to keep up with Kevin. Behind us, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, steady and unrelenting. It was following us. We stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, dead tree. Its gnarled branches twisted against the gray sky, and at its base was a circle of stones arranged with unnerving precision. "What is this?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the footsteps grew louder. The figure stepped into the clearing, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground. Kevin picked up a branch, holding it defensively. "Stay back," he shouted, but the figure didn't stop. It raised one skeletal hand, pointing at the stone circle. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Kevin looked at me, his face pale. "What does it want?" he whispered. I shook my head, unable to speak. The figure stepped into the circle, and the stones began to glow faintly. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest. Kevin dropped the branch, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely audible. We turned to run, but the trail was gone. The trees had closed in around the clearing, their twisted branches forming an impenetrable wall. "No, no, no," Kevin muttered, spinning in circles. The figure began to chant, its voice guttural and incomprehensible. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to shift, as if something massive was moving below. Kevin grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "What's happening?" he shouted. I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was getting away, but there was nowhere to go. The chanting stopped, and the figure turned to face us fully. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in its shadowed face. "Leave," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo in my mind. Kevin and I didn't hesitate. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush in the direction we thought we'd come from. The trees seemed to part for us, the trail reappearing as if by magic. My heart pounded in my chest as we ran, the figure's whisper still ringing in my ears. After what felt like hours, we stumbled onto the main trail. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the forest, and the familiar path filled me with relief. "We made it," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "We're out." We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. The sight of my car was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We climbed in, locking the doors behind us. Kevin was silent as I started the engine and sped away, leaving the mountain behind. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The symbols on the trees, the figure, the stone circle, it didn't make sense. Kevin refused to talk about it, brushing it off as a bad dream. But I knew it was real. Then, one night, I woke to a sound outside my window, a low rhythmic tapping. My chest tightened as I sat up, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. I didn't dare look outside. The next morning, I found something on my doorstep, a small stone, identical to the ones in the circle. It was arranged in a perfect spiral, its center marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. My hand shook as I picked it up. I called Kevin, but he didn't answer. When I drove to his house, the curtains were drawn and his car was gone. A neighbor said he'd left in the middle of the night, muttering something about needing to get away. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I haven't seen Kevin since, and the tapping hasn't stopped. Every night, it grows louder, more insistent. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but it doesn't help. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. The last thing I'll say is this: don't take shortcuts. Don't wander off the marked trails. There are things in the woods that aren't meant to be found, and once they've noticed you, they won't let you go. If you hear the tapping, it's already too late. Next story. The invitation was simple, written in neat cursive on aged paper. Attend the ceremony on Coldwater Road, midnight sharp. Witness the awakening. I almost threw it away. Coldwater Road was miles out of town, surrounded by thick forest. It wasn't on any map. I didn't know who sent it, but curiosity gnawed at me. On the night of the ceremony, I found myself driving down an empty stretch of highway. The road narrowed the farther I went, trees forming a canopy above, blocking the moonlight. Eventually, I saw the faint glow of firelight through the trees. I parked at the edge of a clearing and stepped out. The air was cold, and the silence was unnerving. Ahead, a group of figures stood in a circle, chanting softly. I approached cautiously, staying in the shadows. The figures wore long, dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. In the center of the circle was an altar, carved from black stone, its surface covered in strange, swirling symbols. A woman stepped forward, her hands raised toward the sky. "Tonight we awaken the forgotten," she said, her voice steady and commanding. The others chanted in unison, the air growing heavier with each word. I should have left then, but something held me in place. My heart raced as I watched the ceremony unfold. A dark, viscous liquid was poured onto the altar, and the flames around the circle flickered violently. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The air grew still, and the woman turned, her hood falling back to reveal sharp, angular features and eyes that seemed to glint with an unnatural light. "We have a guest," she said, her gaze locking onto mine. Panic surged through me as every robed figure turned in unison. "Come forward," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. My legs moved against my will, carrying me into the circle. The figures parted, creating a path to the altar. The altar seemed to pulse as though alive. The symbols etched into its surface glowed faintly. "You've been chosen," the woman said. "Tonight you will bear witness to the Forgotten One's return." My mouth was dry, my words caught in my throat. Before I could react, two figures grabbed me, their hands cold and unyielding. They led me to the altar and forced me to kneel. The woman produced a dagger, its blade black as obsidian. "Fear not," she whispered. "This is an honor." She pressed the blade to her palm and let her blood drip onto the altar. The liquid hissed as it made contact, the symbols glowing brighter. The ground beneath us trembled, and a low, guttural sound echoed from the forest. The chanting resumed, louder and more frantic. The flames rose higher, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. The guttural sound grew into a deep, resonant growl, vibrating through my chest. Something was waking. The altar cracked, a jagged line splitting its surface. From within, a dark mist seeped out, swirling and coalescing into a shape. It was massive and undefined, shifting constantly. its presence both overwhelming and horrifying. The woman fell to her knees, her arms outstretched. "Grade 1, we are your servants," she cried. The other figures followed suit, bowing deeply. I remained frozen, my mind racing for a way to escape this nightmare. The mist solidified, forming a shape with too many limbs and eyes that burned like embers. Its voice was a low rumble, each word reverberating through the clearing. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" it asked, its gaze landing on me. "He is your vessel," the woman said, her tone reverent. My blood turned to ice. "No," I stammered, struggling against the hands that held me. The entity moved closer, its form shifting unnaturally. "You are not worthy," it growled. The woman's expression twisted into one of fear. "Grade 1, he was chosen," she said, her voice shaking. The entity's form expanded, towering over her. "You dare presume to choose for me?" It roared. The ground shook violently. The robed figures screamed as the entity lashed out, its limbs moving with impossible speed. One by one, they were consumed by the dark mist, their cries echoing through the forest. The woman tried to flee, but the entity caught her effortlessly. I used the chaos to break free, stumbling toward the trees. Behind me, the entity's rage continued to unfold, its voice a deafening roar. The forest seemed to warp around me, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. I ran blindly, the air thick with the stench of decay. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The entity's voice echoed in my mind, its words incomprehensible but filled with malice. I felt its presence closing in. I tripped over a root, landing hard on my hands and knees. The ground beneath me felt raw, almost alive. I pushed myself up, but the forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same, the trees blending into the suffocating darkness. A sharp, guttural whisper filled the air. It wasn't the entity, but something smaller, closer. I turned, and through the trees, I saw dozens of glowing eyes watching me. They blinked in unison, their shapes barely visible in the dark. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. The eyes moved closer, their shapes shifting into hunched, clawed figures. They surrounded me, their movements synchronized as though they shared a single mind. My back hit a tree, and I held up my hands. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice trembled. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in perfect unison. One stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching for me. Before it could touch me, a deafening roar shook the forest. The entity's massive form appeared in the distance, its limbs thrashing wildly. The figures turned toward it, then scattered like smoke, disappearing into the shadows. The entity's burning eyes locked onto me, and I felt my legs give out. Its voice filled my head, overwhelming and relentless. "You cannot escape," it said. "You belong to me now." My vision blurred as the ground seemed to ripple beneath me. I crawled forward, my hands digging into the dirt. Ahead, I saw a faint light, a small glowing sigil carved into a tree. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Something about it felt familiar, like a memory buried deep in my mind. The sigil grew brighter as I approached, its glow pushing back the darkness. The entity hesitated, its massive form shifting uncertainly. I reached out, my fingers brushing the sigil. A surge of heat coursed through me, and the whispers in my head stopped. The sigil's light expanded, forming a barrier between me and the entity. It roared, its limbs slamming against the invisible wall. The ground shook violently, but the sigil held. I stood, my strength returning as the light surrounded me. The entity's form began to fracture, its edges dissolving into mist. It let out a final, ear-piercing scream before collapsing in on itself, leaving only silence. The sigil dimmed, its glow fading until it was nothing more than a faint carving. I stumbled back, my body trembling. The forest was still again, the trees no longer warped. The air smelled fresh, free of the stench of decay. I turned and ran, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and Coldwater Road. When I reached the clearing, my car was still there, covered in a thin layer of frost. I climbed inside, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back toward the forest. The faint glow of the sigil was still visible. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun began to rise. The world seemed normal again, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment. At home, I locked every door and window, but the sense of safety was fleeting. That night, I dreamed of the sigil, its glow brighter than ever. The whispers returned, faint but insistent. "We are not done," they said. "You cannot resist." When I woke, the sigil was carved into the wall above my bed, glowing faintly. My chest tightened as I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped. The ritual wasn't over. It had only just begun. Next story. I moved into the apartment on a rainy afternoon. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom in a quiet complex, but it was affordable and close to work. The landlord, Mr. Garrison, seemed eager to lease it. "Don't worry about the last tenant," he said. "People come and go." The apartment was plain but functional. Beige walls, thin carpet, a view of the parking lot. As I unpacked, I noticed the living room window didn't lock properly. I made a mental note to mention it to Mr. Garrison, though he didn't seem like the attentive type. That first night, the rain hammered against the glass. I curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the faint draft seeping through the window. Around midnight, I heard a noise of faint tapping. I looked up, expecting to see rain, but the sound was rhythmic. I walked to the window, peering out into the dark parking lot. It was empty, save for the occasional passing car. The tapping stopped as soon as I got close. Shaking my head, I blamed it on the wind and went to bed. The next morning, I mentioned the window to Mr. Garrison. He shrugged, saying, "Old building. Things creak and groan. I'll send someone to look at it." His dismissive tone irritated me, but I didn't push. The tapping from last night felt distant, unimportant. That evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. My heart raced as I crept toward the window. Again, the parking lot was empty. The sound stopped, leaving me in uneasy silence. I pulled the curtain shut, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. Just as I sat down, the tapping started again, this time on the bedroom window. I froze. The bedroom was on the second floor, with no balcony or fire escape. Gripping my phone tightly, I walked to the bedroom. The curtains were closed, but I could hear the tapping clearly. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. I yanked the curtain open, but there was nothing there. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of the building set me on edge. By morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Stress from the move, maybe. But when I checked the window, I found faint smudges on the outside, like fingerprints. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bird or a stray branch had caused the marks. Still, I couldn't bring myself to touch the glass. Instead, I grabbed a roll of tape and sealed the edges of both windows. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. That night, the tapping started earlier. This time, it was on both windows, first the living room, then the bedroom. My chest tightened as I sat frozen on the couch. It felt like whatever was outside was trying to get in. I called a friend, Julie, and asked if she could come over. "You sound spooked," she said. "Want me to bring anything?" I hesitated before answering. "Just yourself," I said. Her voice was reassuring. a tether to normalcy. I needed that. Julie arrived within the hour, her cheerful energy filling the apartment. "So, what's the deal?" she asked, flopping onto the couch. I explained the tapping, the smudges, the unease. She laughed, saying, "It's probably just some animal. Don't overthink it." I wanted to believe her, but as the evening wore on, the tension grew. Around midnight, the tapping returned. Julie frowned, her confidence wavering. "That's weird," she said, walking to the window. She pulled the curtain aside, but saw nothing. "Let's check outside," Julie suggested. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but her presence gave me courage. We grabbed flashlights and stepped into the rain-soaked parking lot. The air was cold, the night eerily quiet. We found no signs of anyone or anything. As we headed back inside, I noticed something strange. On the ground beneath the bedroom window were footprints, bare, human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading away from the building and vanishing into the shadows. Julie stared at the prints, her face pale. "You need to call someone," she said. "The police, maybe." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I'd tell them. There was no crime, no evidence, just a growing sense of dread I couldn't explain. The police came the next morning, a single officer who seemed more annoyed than concerned. He glanced at the footprints and shrugged. "Probably some kid messing around," he said. "Call us if it happens again." His dismissive tone left me feeling helpless. That night, Julie stayed over. We tried to distract ourselves with movies and junk food, but the tension was palpable. Around midnight, the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Julie grabbed my arm. "Don't open the curtain," she whispered. We sat in silence, the tapping continuing relentlessly. Then it stopped. A moment later, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Why won't you let me in?" My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Julie grabbed my phone, her hand shaking. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, unable to speak. The tapping resumed, more frantic this time, as if whatever was outside was growing impatient. The message buzzed again. "I can see you." Julie dropped the phone like it had burned her. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. I grabbed my keys, and we bolted out the door. We drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring through the rain. "Where are we going?" Julie asked. I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that apartment. My chest tightened as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following us. We ended up at a diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the rain. The smell of coffee and fried food was comforting, but my nerves were still on edge. Julie sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a mug. "What do we do now?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. The apartment felt like a trap, but I couldn't just abandon it. My savings were gone, sunk into the lease. As I stared out the diner window, a figure caught my eye, tall and shadowy, standing under a street lamp, watching. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. "What's wrong?" Julie asked, following my gaze. By the time she looked, the figure was gone, leaving only an empty street. "You're imagining things," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. We decided to stay at Julie's place for the night. Her apartment was small, but felt safe. She locked the windows and pulled the curtains tight. "Try to sleep," she said. But sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. Around 3 a.m. my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You can't hide." My breath caught in my throat as I showed it to Julie. Her face went pale. "This isn't normal," she said. "Whatever this is, it's not human." The next day, I went back to the apartment, determined to gather my things and leave for good. Julie insisted on coming with me. The place felt colder than before, the air heavy and oppressive. The windows were still taped, but the smudges had returned, darker this time. As we packed, Julie noticed something on the bedroom wall, a faint outline, like a shadow burned into the paint. "Was this here before?" she asked. I shook my head, dread pulling in my stomach. The shadow seemed to shift as we stared at it. The tapping started again, this time louder and more chaotic. It came from every window, every wall surrounding us. Julie grabbed my arm, panic in her eyes. "We need to go now," she said. I didn't argue. We ran for the door, leaving everything behind. The hallway was darker than it should have been, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. As we reached the stairwell, I heard a voice, faint and distorted, calling my name. I stopped, my legs trembling. "Don't stop," Julie shouted, pulling me forward. We made it to the car, slamming the door shut. As I fumbled with the keys, something appeared in the rearview mirror, a figure standing in the apartment window, watching. My hand shook as I started the car, peeling out of the parking lot. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the city lights far behind. Julie turned to me, her face pale. "It's not over, is it?" she asked. I didn't answer. Deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever was in that apartment had followed us. A week later, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the window. I didn't need to look to know what I'd see. The shadow had found me. No matter where I go, I'll never be alone again. Next story. It started with a dare, as most bad decisions do. My friend Lisa convinced me and two others to explore the abandoned St. Mary's Asylum on the outskirts of town. "It's just an old building," she said. "What's the worst that could happen?" I wish I hadn't agreed. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after it was shut down for malpractice allegations. It stood like a crumbling giant, surrounded by weeds and chain-link fences. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay as we cut through the fence. Lisa led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The inside was worse than I imagined, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and graffiti covering the walls. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls, making the place feel even lonelier. We found the patient rooms first, small spaces with rusted beds and shattered windows. Each room felt wrong, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the pain and despair of those who once lived there. Lisa laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in my chest. In one room, I found an old patient chart, its pages yellowed with age. The name was smudged, but the diagnosis was clear: schizophrenia, severe depression. I wondered what had happened to the patient. Did they leave when the hospital closed? Or had they died here? As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder. We reached the common area, where broken chairs were scattered across the floor. A rusted wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels slightly turned as if someone had left it in a hurry. I felt like we weren't alone. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed down the hall. "It's probably just the wind," Lisa said, but her voice wavered. We followed the sound, our footsteps slow and deliberate. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the peeling paint and flickering shadows playing tricks on my mind. At the end of the hall, we found a door ajar, leading to the basement. None of us wanted to go down there. Lisa, ever the brave one, insisted we explored the basement. "It's probably where they kept the worst patients," she said, her excitement unsettling. I hesitated, but the others followed her lead. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step amplifying my dread. The basement was worse than I imagined. The air was damp and smelled of rot. Old medical equipment was scattered around, covered in cobwebs. In the corner, a rusted gurney lay on its side, its leather straps frayed and dangling. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Lisa found a row of cells, each with heavy metal doors. "This must have been solitary confinement," she said, shining her flashlight into one of them. The room was small, with a drain in the floor and scratch marks on the walls. My stomach churned. We were about to leave when the door to one of the cells slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed through the basement, making us all jump. "Who did that?" Lisa demanded, her voice trembling. None of us had touched the door. My hands started to sweat. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. Suddenly, a low moan filled the room, coming from somewhere behind us. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just a dark, empty hallway. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lisa ignored me and pushed forward, leading us deeper into the basement. The moaning grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone in pain. "It's probably just the wind," Lisa repeated, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. We turned a corner and found an old operating room. The surgical table was rusted, its leather straps still intact. Instruments lay scattered on the floor, scalpels, clamps, tools I couldn't identify. A dark stain spread across the tiles, too faded to tell if it was blood. Lisa stepped closer to the table, her flashlight illuminating the straps. "Can you imagine what they did here?" she asked. Before anyone could answer, the moaning turned into a scream, a blood-curdling, agonized wail that made my blood run cold. The lights on our flashlights flickered, plunging us into brief moments of darkness. When the beam steadied, I saw something move in the corner of the room. A shadow, quick and unnatural. "Who's there?" Lisa shouted, but there was no response. A loud bang echoed through the room as the surgical table shifted, its wheels screeching against the tiles. We all screamed and bolted for the hallway. My heart raced as I tried to keep up, the moaning and screams following us like a twisted symphony. We didn't stop running until we reached the stairs. Lisa tried the door at the top, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she yelled, panic in her voice. The moaning grew louder, and I swear I could hear footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. "Push harder," one of the others screamed. I threw my weight against the door, and after a moment, it burst open. We stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind us. For a moment, everything was silent, but then the door handle began to rattle. Lisa grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the handle. "That should hold it," she said, though her voice shook. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew the truth. Whatever was down there wasn't human, and it wasn't going to stop. We hurried through the asylum, retracing our steps toward the entrance. The building seemed different now, the hallways longer and the shadows darker. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. "Keep moving," Lisa shouted, pulling me forward. We reached the patient rooms, but the door we'd entered through was gone. In its place was another hallway, one that hadn't been there before. "This doesn't make sense," someone muttered, their voice trembling. Lisa hesitated, but the sound of footsteps behind us forced her to choose. "This way," she said, leading us into the new hallway. It was narrower than the others, the walls closing in as we moved. The air grew colder, and I felt like I was suffocating. We turned a corner and found ourselves in what looked like an old office. Papers were scattered everywhere, and a typewriter sat on the desk, its keys rusted. A single chair faced the wall, rocking slightly as if someone had just been sitting there. The rocking stopped, and the chair slowly turned to face us. It was empty, but the seat was indented, as if someone invisible was still sitting there. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. Lisa nodded, for once not arguing. We ran again, not caring where we went as long as it was away from that room. The hallways twisted and turned, each one looking the same as the last. I began to wonder if we were running in circles, trapped in some kind of maze. Finally, we stumbled into the common area, the same one we'd seen earlier, but something was different. The wheelchair was gone, and the graffiti on the walls had changed. Instead of random tags, it now spelled out a single word: stay. Lisa froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "This isn't real," she muttered. "This can't be real." But it was real. The moaning had returned, louder and closer than before. I looked around, searching for an exit, but there was none. Suddenly, the moaning turned into laughter, deep, guttural laughter that echoed through the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. One of the others screamed, bolting toward a door that hadn't been there a moment ago. We followed, desperate for a way out. The door led to another hallway, this one lined with mirrors. As we ran, our reflections distorted, becoming unrecognizable. My face stretched and twisted in the glass, my own eyes staring back at me with malice. At the end of the hallway, we found a staircase leading up. We didn't hesitate, scrambling up the steps two at a time. The laughter faded, replaced by a deafening silence. At the top of the stairs was a single door, its handle rusted but unlocked. The door led back to the main entrance. The chain-link fence we'd cut through was visible through the broken windows. Relief washed over me as we bolted for the exit, the cold night air hitting my face like a blessing. We didn't stop running until we reached the road. We stood there, catching our breath and looking back at the asylum. It loomed in the darkness, silent and still. "We're never coming back here," Lisa said, her voice firm. None of us argued. Whatever was inside that place wasn't meant to be disturbed. A week later, I found an envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the four of us standing in the common area, taken from an angle none of us could have captured. In the background, barely visible, was the outline of a shadowy figure. Next story. I was driving home late when I saw the sign. Carnival of Whispers, one night only. It pointed down a dirt road I'd never noticed before, its letters glowing faintly under the moonlight. Exhausted but curious, I turned onto the road, the headlights slicing through the dark. The path led to an open field. There was a sprawling carnival, lit with strings of golden bulbs. The ride spun lazily, and faint music drifted through the air. It was strange, though. There were no cars, no people, just the carnival waiting. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and something sweeter, almost metallic. My chest tightened as I approached the gate. A man in a red coat stood there, smiling too widely. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth but hollow. "No ticket needed tonight. Come in. Enjoy the wonders." I hesitated, but his outstretched hand beckoned me. "Everything is free," he added, as if sensing my doubt. Against my better judgment, I walked inside. The carnival was a strange mix of vibrant and decrepit. The carousel spun slowly, its paint peeling but its music pristine. Booths lined the paths, offering games and prizes. Still, there were no other visitors. My footsteps echoed as I wandered. At one booth, a woman with dark eyes and a painted smile gestured to a game of darts. "Care to try?" she asked, her voice lilting. I nodded, and she handed me 3 darts. The targets seemed to shimmer, their edges too sharp to be real. I threw the first dart, and it hit dead center. The woman clapped, her grin widening unnaturally. "One more," she urged. I threw again, and the dart sank into the target with a dull thud. "Your prize," she said, handing me a small mirror. The mirror was cold in my hand, its surface cloudy. When I looked into it, my reflection stared back, but it didn't move when I did. I blinked, and it smiled, a cruel, knowing grin. I dropped the mirror, and it shattered on the ground. The woman's smile faltered. "Careful," she whispered, her tone suddenly serious. "Breaking things here has consequences." I stepped back, mumbling an apology, but her gaze followed me as I hurried away. The lights around me dimmed slightly. I wandered toward the Ferris wheel, hoping the view would calm my nerves. The operator, a thin man with hollow cheeks, motioned for me to enter. "Best seat in the house," he said. I climbed into the carriage, and the wheel creaked to life. As the wheel turned, the carnival spread out below me. From above, it looked endless, stretching far beyond the field where I'd parked. Shadows danced between the rides, moving too quickly to belong to anything human. My stomach twisted. At the top of the wheel, the carriage stopped. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I looked down, and my blood ran cold. The man in the red coat was standing below, staring up at me. His face was blank, his eyes too bright. When the wheel finally moved again, I scrambled out as soon as it reached the ground. The operator was gone, and the controls were covered in dust, as if they hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I backed away. The music changed, growing slower and more discordant. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows. I turned down a path lined with funhouse mirrors. The reflections were warped, each one showing me with a twisted smile or hollow eyes. "Enjoying yourself?" The voice made me jump. The man in the red coat stood at the end of the path, his smile too wide for his face. "You're special," he said, stepping closer. "The carnival doesn't invite just anyone." My legs refused to move. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. His smile didn't waver. "I don't want anything," he said. "But the carnival, it needs you." His voice was soft, almost soothing, but his eyes burned with an unnatural light. I turned and ran, the mirrors distorting my reflection into monstrous shapes. His laughter echoed behind me, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere. The carnival twisted around me, paths looping back on themselves. I stumbled into a tent marked Hall of Memories. Inside, the air was thick and warm, and a carousel of photographs lined the walls. My own childhood stared back at me, birthday parties, school plays, moments I hadn't remembered until now. I reached for a photo, one of me as a kid on a Ferris wheel. My fingers brushed the surface, and the image shifted. The smiling child in the photo turned to stare directly at me. Its grin widened as it whispered, "You've always been here." I dropped the photo, backing away as the other images began to move. The people in the pictures, my family, my friends, all turned toward me, their eyes hollow and accusing. Their mouths moved, forming soundless words. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices calling my name. I bolted out of the tent, my heart racing. The carnival seemed alive, the ground beneath my feet pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't know where to go. The ride spun faster, the lights flashing in erratic patterns. The laughter of unseen crowds filled the air, but I was still alone. I ran toward the entrance, desperate to escape, but the gate was gone. In its place stood a wall of mirrors. The man in the red coat appeared in the reflection, his image repeated infinitely. "There's no leaving," he said, his voice low and echoing. "The carnival is part of you now." I turned, but he wasn't behind me, only in the mirrors. I smashed one of the mirrors with my fist, shards cutting into my skin. The pieces scattered across the ground, reflecting fragments of his face. The air grew colder, and the fragments began to move, shifting back into his form. He stepped out of the broken mirror, whole again, his smile sharper than before. "Violence won't help you," he said, brushing off glass shards. "You'll only hurt yourself." He pointed toward the Ferris wheel. "It's time." "I'm not going back," I said, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, amused. It's not about what you want. The carnival chose you. His words wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. My feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the Ferris wheel. The wheel towered above me, its lights pulsating like a heartbeat. The operator was gone, but the carriage door opened on its own. "Step inside," the man said, his voice softer now, almost kind. "You'll understand everything soon." I resisted, my legs trembling, but the pull was too strong. I climbed into the carriage, and the door slammed shut. The wheel began to turn, faster than before, the air whipping past me. Below, the carnival blurred into a mass of lights and shadows. At the top of the wheel, everything stopped. The air was still, the carnival silent. In the distance, I could see the field where I'd parked, my car sitting untouched. Hope surged through me. Then I looked down. The carnival was gone. In its place was a vast black void, stretching endlessly in all directions. The man in the red coat stood on the Ferris wheel's center platform, his arms outstretched. "This is the truth," he said. "The carnival doesn't exist," he continued. "It's a reflection, a place where your fears, your memories, your desires take form." His voice grew deeper, resonating through the void. "You can't escape it because it's you." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't real," I whispered. "It's a nightmare." The man's grin widened. "Nightmares are real, and so is this." The carriage began to descend, the void swallowing the Ferris wheel piece by piece. When I reached the ground, the carnival reappeared, vibrant and whole. The ride spun, the music played, and the air smelled sweet again. But I knew it was a lie. The man in the red coat stood by the gate, his eyes glowing faintly. "You can go," he said, stepping aside, "but you'll be back." They always come back. I ran past him, not looking back. My car was still in the field. I started the engine and sped away, the carnival shrinking in my rearview mirror. Back home, I locked the doors and turned on every light. But when I looked out the window, the carnival lights twinkled on the horizon. Its whispers filled my ears. "One night only. Just for you." And deep down, I knew I couldn't resist. Next story. I got the night shift at the warehouse after losing my last job. The pay wasn't great, but the hours suited my quiet life. My boss handed me a set of keys and a clipboard saying, "Just check the cameras every hour and make sure nothing's out of place." Easy enough. The warehouse was massive, filled with rows of towering shelves stacked with boxes. The security office, where I spent most of my shift, was small and cramped. The monitors buzzed faintly, displaying grainy footage from 20 different cameras. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent the hours flipping through an old paperback, occasionally glancing at the monitors. The cameras showed nothing but still shadows and the occasional rat darting across the floor. On the second night, I noticed something strange. One of the cameras, positioned near the loading dock, flickered for a moment before the screen went black. I checked the feed again, but the image was still dark. I made a note to tell the boss in the morning. Later, while walking my rounds, I passed the loading dock. The camera hung there, its lens cracked. A faint chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard anything hit it, and the warehouse was silent as a tomb. I moved on quickly. The next night, the camera feed returned, but something was off. The angle seemed slightly different, as if the camera had been moved. The image was sharper than before, almost unnaturally clear. I could see every detail of the empty dock. Around 3 a.m. at the loading dock feed again. A figure stood in the corner of the frame, just barely visible in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I switched to the next camera, but the figure was gone. Flipping back to the loading dock, the frame was empty. My stomach churned. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a glitch in the system. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I barely slept. When I returned for my next shift, I checked the loading dock camera first. The frame was empty, the feed normal. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself I'd imagined the whole thing. At 2 a.m., the figure returned. This time, it was closer, standing near one of the crates. Its head tilted slightly, as if it knew I was watching. My hand shook as I stared at the screen. I reached for the walkie-talkie but stopped. Who would I call? I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the loading dock. The air felt colder as I approached. The crates loomed tall and silent, casting long shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No one answered. The dock was empty, just as the camera had shown earlier. But something caught my eye, a dark, sticky substance smeared across one of the crates. I leaned closer, the smell of iron filling my nose. Blood. My stomach churned as I backed away. I hurried back to the office, locking the door behind me. The figure was gone from the monitor. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't far. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see it standing there. The next night, I almost didn't come in, but rent was due, and I couldn't afford to lose another job. The cameras seemed normal at first. Then, around midnight, every screen flickered at once, the feeds going dark. When the monitors came back on, the figure was there. It was closer now, its form clearer. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over a thin frame. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its hollow eye stared directly at the camera. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, slowly, its hand reached out, pressing against the lens of the camera. The feed cut out, replaced by static. My heart pounded as I leaned back, every nerve in my body screaming to run. Suddenly, the camera in the hallway outside the office lit up. The figure was there, standing motionless, its face turned toward the door. I grabbed the flashlight and keys, unsure of what to do. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold them. The door handle rattled. My chest tightened as I backed away, the flashlight beam trembling in my grip. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response, just the sound of the handle turning. The door didn't open, but the rattling grew louder. Then it stopped. The monitors flickered again, showing nothing but static. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood frozen, waiting for the next move. When the feeds returned, the cameras showed something impossible. Me, standing in the office. The image on the screen was me, but it wasn't right. My reflection stared back with empty eyes, its movements delayed, twitching unnaturally. I reached for the monitor, my fingers brushing the cold screen. The image grinned, a wide, unnatural smile. I stumbled back from the screen, my legs shaking. The grin on the monitor widened, the image raising its hand in a mocking wave. The lights in the office flickered, and I could feel the air growing colder, heavier. I fumbled for the keys, ready to run. Before I could reach the door, the monitors all went black again. The static returned, but this time it wasn't random. Words formed in the noise, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." My breath caught, my chest tightening as the words repeated. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, as if someone or something was trying to break it down. I pressed my back against the far wall, clutching the flashlight. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. The silence was worse. I crept toward the door, peering through the small glass window. The hallway was empty. My pulse raced as I turned back to the monitors. They were still dark, except for one camera feed showing the loading dock. The figure was there again, standing in the same spot as before, but now it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their forms twitching and distorted, as if they didn't belong in this world. They all turned to face the camera at once. I couldn't look away. One by one, the figures stepped closer, their movements jerky and wrong. The static on the other monitors began to clear, each feed showing the same thing. Those figures moving toward different parts of the warehouse. A loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I grabbed the keys and bolted for the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit and eerily silent. The footsteps grew louder, echoing from all directions. I ran, my shoes slamming against the floor as I searched for an exit. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the darkness. Ahead, a shadow moved. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow grew larger, taking shape as one of the figures stepped into the light. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its twisted grin spread unnaturally wide. "Stay," it whispered, the words sharp and guttural. I turned and ran the other way, adrenaline pushing me forward. The sound of footsteps followed, faster and heavier. I reached the emergency exit, slamming into the door and shoving it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap. The parking lot was empty, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands shook so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the warehouse. The figures stood at the edge of the lot, their forms silhouetted against the faint glow of the building. They didn't move, just watched as I started the engine. My tires screeched as I sped away, the cold knot in my stomach refusing to ease. At home, I locked every door and window, leaving all the lights on. My phone buzzed on the table, and I grabbed it with shaking hands. A notification popped up, a motion alert from the warehouse cameras. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The live feed showed my office, the chair still pulled out, papers scattered on the desk. But in the corner of the frame was one of the figures, its grin wide and unblinking. The timestamp on the feed wasn't from the warehouse. It was from my house. My heart stopped as I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. Slowly, I turned to look. The figure was there, its hollow eyes meeting mine through the glass. My screen buzzed with static as its voice whispered one final word. "Open?" Next story. It was supposed to be a weekend escape. My brother Ethan had insisted on taking a camping trip deep into Vermont's Green Mountains. "It'll be good for us," he said. I wasn't so sure. The isolation was unsettling, but I agreed. I hadn't seen Ethan this excited in years. We set up camp near a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that carried the faint smell of decaying leaves. "This is perfect," Ethan said, unpacking the tent. His enthusiasm was contagious, but something about the woods felt off. By nightfall, the fire crackled brightly, and we shared stories over cheap beer. Ethan talked about work, his girlfriend, and how much he needed this getaway. I nodded, trying to relax. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Around midnight, I heard a noise of faint snapping of twigs. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Ethan waved it off. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, throwing another log on the fire. I tried to believe him, but the unease in my chest grew. I woke up to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, and Ethan was snoring softly in the tent beside me. The snapping sound returned, louder this time, coming from just beyond the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The noise stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. Then, a low, guttural growl broke through the stillness. It wasn't an animal, not any animal I'd ever heard. My skin prickled with fear. I whispered Ethan's name, shaking his shoulder. Ethan groaned, half asleep. "It's nothing," he muttered. But the growl came again, closer this time. Ethan sat up, his face pale in the dim firelight. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. I wanted to say no, but my voice caught in my throat. We stepped into the woods, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The growling had stopped, but the air felt heavier, colder. "Probably just a coyote," Ethan whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. I stayed close, every nerve on edge. The beam of light flickered across something on the ground tracks, deep and clawed, too large to belong to any animal native to these woods. Ethan knelt down, running his fingers over the marks. "What the hell made these?" he murmured. Before I could answer, a sound erupted behind us, a loud, crashing noise, like something huge moving through the trees. We spun around, the flashlight shaking in Ethan's hand. The forest was dark, impenetrable. Whatever was out there didn't want to stay hidden. "Let's head back," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his bravado fading. We walked quickly, the flashlight illuminating the narrow path back to camp. The crashing followed us, always just out of sight. My chest tightened with every step. When we reached the clearing, the fire was out completely. The air smelled different, metallic, like blood. Ethan froze, pointing toward the tent. It was shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters. "No way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A low growl came from the tree line, deeper and more menacing than before. My stomach churned as I turned toward the sound. Two glowing eyes stared back at us, unblinking, their amber light cutting through the darkness. Ethan grabbed my arm. "Run." We bolted, crashing through the forest in a blind panic. Branches whipped against my face, but I didn't care. The growling followed us, growing louder, closer. I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet as something massive gave chase. Ethan tripped, falling hard onto the ground. I turned back, reaching for him. The creature burst into the clearing, a massive, emaciated figure, its skin stretched tight over jagged bones. Its face was elongated, almost human, but horribly wrong. I pulled Ethan to his feet, and we ran again, adrenaline drowning out the burning in my legs. The creature didn't roar or scream, it just pursued us with relentless speed. The glow of its eyes burned into my memory, searing like fire. We stumbled upon an old cabin, its wooden walls weathered and cracked. Ethan threw open the door, and we rushed inside, slamming it shut behind us. The cabin was dark, its air thick with dust. "What the hell is that thing?" I gasped. Ethan shook his head, his chest heaving. "I don't know, but it's not stopping." The creature's growl echoed outside, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the walls. The cabin shook as it slammed against the door. My heart felt like it would explode. The creature clawed at the door, its growls low and guttural, each strike shaking the flimsy wooden walls. Ethan grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the corner, his hands trembling. "This won't hold," he muttered, his voice cracking. "We need a plan." I scanned the cabin, searching for anything useful. A trapdoor in the corner caught my eye. "Down here," I said, pulling it open. A narrow set of stairs led into darkness. Ethan hesitated, but another violent slam against the door made up his mind. We descended quickly, the musty smell of damp wood filling the air. The trapdoor creaked shut above us, leaving us in pitch-black darkness. Ethan turned on his flashlight, its weak beam revealing a dirt floor and walls lined with rotting shelves. The growling above us grew louder, more furious. The creature was inside the cabin now, its claws scraping against the floorboards. My hand shook as I clutched a broken piece of wood, useless as a weapon but comforting to hold. Ethan whispered, "It's looking for us." His words sent chills down my spine. The scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find the trapdoor. Then, the breathing turned into a low, rumbling growl. The trapdoor creaked. Slowly, it began to open, a sliver of amber light spilling into the basement. Ethan raised the pipe, his knuckles white. The creature's face appeared, grotesque and skeletal, its glowing eyes scanning the room. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. Ethan let out a roar and swung the pipe, striking the creature's face. It reeled back, a guttural snarl erupting from its throat. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pushing me toward a narrow tunnel at the back of the basement. We crawled through the tunnel, the space so tight I could feel the dirt scraping against my shoulders. Behind us, the creature let out an ear-piercing scream, its claws raking against the walls as it pursued us. The sound of its growling filled the tunnel, growing closer. The tunnel opened into another part of the forest, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I scrambled to my feet, pulling Ethan up beside me. "We can't stop," he gasped, blood trickling from a gash on his arm. "It's still coming." We ran blindly through the forest, the creature's screams echoing behind us. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I didn't dare slow down. Ahead, a faint light appeared through the trees. "There!" I shouted, hope surging through me. As we drew closer, I realized it was an old ranger station, its windows glowing faintly. "It's our only chance," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. The station was small and empty, with a dusty radio on the desk. Ethan grabbed it, twisting the dials. Come on," he muttered. Static crackled, but no voices came through. The creature's growl surrounded the station, circling like a predator stalking its prey. The walls shook as it slammed against them, each impact more violent than the last. "We're trapped," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. The radio sputtered, a faint voice breaking through the static. "Ranger Station 5, do you copy?" Ethan shouted into the receiver. "We're trapped. Something's after us." The voice replied, calm but chilling. "Stay inside. Don't let it in. It can't survive the sunrise." The growling intensified, the walls creaking under the force of the creature's attacks. Ethan and I barricaded the door with a heavy desk, every sound sending jolts of fear through my body. "It's almost dawn," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "We just have to hold on." The first rays of sunlight broke through the windows, golden and warm. The creature let out a deafening roar, its skeletal form writhing as the light touched it. Its body began to crack and crumble, the glow in its eyes fading. By the time the sun was fully up, the creature was gone, leaving nothing but claw marks and broken furniture. Ethan and I sat in silence, the relief overwhelming. We didn't speak as we walked back to the road, but we both knew one thing. We'd never return to the woods.